Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to embark upon Module 5 of Phase 2, in which we're going to investigate aspects of training and management of the London Fire Brigade, which we were not able to investigate in Phase 1. Today we're going to hear opening statements from various core participants, but before we come to them, we're going to hear first from Counsel to the inquiry, Mr. Richard Millett, Queen's Counsel. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Good morning to you. Good morning to members of the panel, Mr. Stefan and Mr. Akbor. Today's opening addresses mark the start of Module 5, during which we will investigate the remaining matters concerning the London Fire Brigade's response to the Grenfell Tower fire on the 14th of June 2017 that could not be addressed in Phase 1. We will also investigate 3 other specific topics that arise from the Chairman's findings in the Phase 1 report. Those specific topics are as follows. First, the adequacy and effectiveness of visits carried out by the LFB under Section 72D of the Fire and Rescue Services Act 2004 to obtain information which is necessary to discharge the LFB's statutory function to extinguish fires. Secondly, training, and with particular focus on the training provided by the LFB to incident commanders and in relation, in particular, there to evacuation. And thirdly, alternative firefighting strategies in high-rise buildings. As to the structure of Module 5, we are going to start with opening statements by certain of the core participants today. Starting from tomorrow, we will hear evidence from past and present senior LFB officers on the topics that I've mentioned. You will recall that at Phase 1, the inquiry called evidence from some 88 LFB employees, and the statements of a further 262 LFB witnesses were read into the record. In this Module 5, the inquiry will not therefore be calling any further factual evidence about the events on the night of the fire on the 14th of June 2017. Those events have been the subject of detailed analysis and findings in the Phase 1 report. The inquiry currently expects the factual evidence of this Module 5 to take 14 or so sitting days. Following the factual evidence, we will then hear from 3 of the 4 experts retained by the inquiry for the purposes of this module. Those experts are as follows. 1, Professor Chris Johnson, who has examined the effectiveness of the LFB's communication systems. 2, Mr. Steve McGurk, who will deal in broad terms with firefighting on the night. And 3, Professor Jose Terrero, who will consider general issues arising from the firefighting response. We expect that evidence, the evidence of each expert, will take 1 day apiece. Dr. Ivan Stoyanov has addressed certain issues relating to water on the night of the fire. In the light of some of the points made by Thames Water and the LFB very recently in their opening submissions, the inquiry team has decided to call Dr. Stoyanov's evidence later in Module 7 to allow him to consider the points that have been raised. Finally, I should make it clear that the first part of Module 6 will be concerned with further questions for the LFB and others, such as the sufficiency of the LFB's policy arrangements for the management of fire survival guidance calls, MHCLG's policy document GRA 3.2 and evacuation, the translation of knowledge within the LFB of risks presented by cladding fires in high-rise buildings into operational policy and practice, and the lessons learned and arising from the Lakenhall House fire and other relevant fires in this country and abroad. We intend to examine those matters in Module 6, but also, to some extent, in this Module 5. I should also make it clear that in Module 6, the inquiry will hear evidence from the present London Fire Commissioner and his 2 immediate predecessors. Mr. Chairman, that is all I propose to say by way of opening statement.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. Well, now the first of the core participants, legal representatives to address us, is Mr. Friedman, Queen's Counsel. And since he's in the room, he's ready to go slightly earlier than we suggested we might be able to hear him. Good morning, Mr. Friedman.
Good morning, Sir Martin.
Good to see you. Are you ready to make your statement?
I am, and we are grateful to the arrangements that have been made for the remote hearings, but also happy to see you here this morning. And good morning to Miss Estevan and Mr. Akbar too. Firefighters don't cause fires. They respond to the threats of other people's making. But that does not insulate fire services from the need to achieve competency in what they do. And at Grenfell Tower, the London Fire Brigade confronted the limits of its competency. The depth of its deficiencies exposed an organisation that could not cope with an emergency beyond the normal or standard fire. Although unusual, the catastrophic consequences of high-rise building failure were foreseeable and foretold. Still, the LFB remained dangerously unprepared. The inescapable function of fire services is to compensate for the errors of architecture, design, and other control systems, which once failed will lead to disaster if not responded to effectively. That is why we say to all the firefighting parties at this inquiry that the gross negligence of the contractors, the hijacking of regulations by companies, and the economics of successive governments cannot serve as full excuses. There are aspects of the LFB's undoing at Grenfell Tower that were caused by the culture of the organisation. Caught in its traditions, fiercely cared for by its unions, its heroic status makes it rare for it to face public criticism, but that in turn makes it hard to honestly assess its deeper limitations. All these things have burdened the LFB in making change. And for reasons I now turn to, the LFB is unlikely to reimagine itself to correct the deficiencies exposed by this disaster without outside intervention. Our starting point is management capability. The generation that led the LFB in its period up to Grenfell Tower had largely entered as young adults at watch station level, mostly during the 1980s, and worked their way up through the ranks to middle and senior officer roles. It was normal for them to have no relevant university qualifications, and they appear to have had little training in leadership and management skills. With some notable exceptions like Paul Grimwood and Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, who the inquiry is about to hear from, few leaders of operational firefighters had developed understanding of management, fire engineering, or behavioural psychology. In turn, these managers promoted those coming up behind them without what would now be regarded as transparent and fair procedures, with little fast-tracking of talent or competitive lateral hires from other services or sectors. In our written document, we've summarised the findings of 20 years of independent reviews and that have repeatedly said the same thing. From the Audit Commission in 1995, the Bain Review in 2002, the Knight Review in 2013, and the Thomas Review in 2015, the constant refrain has been that fire services are heavily managed but insufficiently led because its leadership does not have the training, development, or competitive recruitment to do better. These criticisms are relevant to the LFB. The Brigade had advice from Babcock in 2014 to introduce mandatory formal management accreditation into each level of leadership. A peer review by representatives from other services in 2015 underscored the need for a change in leadership style and better connection with staff at all levels. After the Grenfell Tower, the Internal People Services Review, completed in 2017 December by then Assistant Commissioner Rowe, acknowledged for the first time in anything we have seen that the Brigade lacked, quote, a clear, structured programme of change encompassing in particular leadership and performance management. This would need, it said, external multidisciplinary support and better leadership development and recruitment to combat what it described as stagnation and a lack of new thinking. For more than a decade, central government had ceased inspection of fire services. But when Her Majesty's Inspectorate investigated the LFB in 2019, it found that processes for selecting, developing and promoting middle and senior management lack effective recording and openness, and there were few opportunities for staff to develop leadership capabilities. When the Inspectorate returned to assess the LFB in 2020, just after your Phase 1 recommendation, sir, it still found that the basic building blocks of programme and change management are only now being established. If that was the finding in 2020, the LFB not only lacked those basic arrangements to manage, lead and assure its service in June 2017, but we say no one in the organisation's leadership had urgently identified how lacking it was in its capacity to do so. The consequence was a management system that was highly resistant to change. The inquiry will need to consider how funding reductions contributed to lack of innovation, especially after 2010. Yet the shortcomings of the LFB at Grenfell Tower have roots long before austerity and are to do with a considerable consensus across all ranks of fire services that are unwilling to transform the nature of what they do. Firefighting, despite its courageous values and high level of comradeship and public service, remains a conservative vocation. It has a problem with progressive organisational thinking at various levels, and not just at the top. Firefighters find it difficult to transform when transformation is due. In terms of understanding what went wrong at Grenfell Tower, a pertinent focus is that both the management and the crews grew out of the watch and shift culture and its drilled approaches to particular forms of standard firefighting responses and very significant demands for peer group conformity. Indeed, those who climb to the heights of leadership will often have excelled within that culture and part of its self-reinforcing cycle. Again, since the turn of the century, reports have repeatedly focused on this problem. In 1999, Her Majesty's Inspectorate found that, quote, the watch is a closed culture which takes on the character of a family rather than a team, where the emphasis is on fitting in, not on tolerating diversity. 20 years later, the renewed HM Inspectorate still describes some watches as having created their own subcultures, which are contrary to service values and have proved impenetrable for new staff, and where teams have worked together for many years, working practices haven't yet modernised. The LFB has a well-documented difficulty in this area. Its peer review in 2015 described a them and us culture affecting trust, openness and respect that went well beyond the division between management and union. Adrian Thomas in the same year felt that distance from London was by no means a rule, but distance did seem to allow a greater degree of independent thinking, more flexible thinking, and acceptance of change from the employee representatives. The HM inspection of the LFB in 2019 equally found that changes understood to be required after Grenfell Tower were, quote, slow to implement, which is typical of the Brigade's approach to organisational change. And in recent years, innovation has stifled and staff reported a lack of organisational desire for change. Sir, all of that begs the question, why this conservative and quite fearful workplace culture continues to prevail in what is otherwise a courageous community of people? There is an insider's answer to that question in Dave Badgett's study entitled One More Last Working Class Hero, a cultural audit of the UK Fire Service. The author is an academic sociologist who was previously a member of the LFB and the FBU. He describes 3 features of firefighting life. First, the heroic and still highly male-gendered need to get into the fire. Second, the need to get on and fit in with watch colleagues. And third, the tendency to see an us and them divide between management and station, but also between the heroism of the notional front line and those non-operational theorists who focus on prevention and policy. Badgett's work is going to no doubt have its opponents. But Dr. Cohen Hatton has spoken about the toxicity and fearfulness of the dominant male heroic model that both men and women who work in the services feel that they have to live up to. This analysis also strongly resonates with those BSR who told the inquiry at the end of Phase 1 hearings that what they wanted was not heroes, but well-trained professionals working to a well-structured plan. What occurred instead was the flooding of the building and firefighters and equipment all going in without conceptual tools or adequate training to do things differently. For the BSR, there were agonising failures of training on the night of the fire. So many firefighters with so much experience could not recognise an event of complete building failure unfolding before their eyes, and consequently when and how to evacuate it. We know that evacuation happened in Melbourne in 2014, and it happened just recently in Milan. Why didn't it happen in London in 2017? The difficult truth is that previous experience of firefighters turned out to be their greatest impediment. They could not see what they did not know. They could not do what they had never experienced. Professor Terrero's root cause explanation for their knowledge deficit is that operational firefighters are intentionally trained to achieve proficiency in planned or set firefighting methods, as opposed to encouraging developmental learning, skill and psychology. They cannot work effectively beyond unexperienced events. Terrero's key point is that training is presently underdeveloped for anything other than what he calls design anticipated fires. The essential features of the design are: 1, the presumption that compartmentation will hold; 2, a default position to favour direct interaction with fire as opposed to considering other options such as evacuation; and 3, the predisposition to act out the internal heroic image of the responder who fights the fire. In Terrero's view, the presently trained personnel can discharge firefighting plans, but they are not proficient in formulating new ones. The presumption of regulatory compliance, including having stay put as the emergency plan, has caused the training to deliver standardised operational tactics and excused firefighters from needing any proper understanding of building behaviour. All of that came unstuck at Grenfell Tower. Terrero primarily puts the cause down to the fact that in all areas, government, private and fire service, competency in fire engineering has not kept up with the complexities of modern design. That, he says, is to do with the lower status of fire engineering as an academic and vocational discipline, as against other forms of engineering, causing it still to resemble a regulated trade as opposed to a profession. The lack of competency of those who led on fire engineering within the fire services is particularly damaging twice over. It cannot hold the responsible persons under the fire safety order to account, and at the same time cannot obtain enough influence within the fire services to qualify the operational protocols relating to standardised design firefighting. Whatever the grounds to criticise the outsourcing of training to Babcock, that issue should not detract from the primary blockages caused by the educational traditions in which the LFB operational responders are trained. They are still taught by instructors who are largely previous or current serving members of the brigade, who were themselves firefighters in the traditional image and mould, and LFB managers are the ones that commission and audit the training, and they also tend to be from the same background. The BSR will look to the inquiry to establish whether the training provided by Babcock was worse than its predecessor, but their major concern is that it didn't get any better. Despite the industrial relations sensitivities, we are also bound to observe that whatever the continuing advantages of a strict watch-shift system, it is inconsistent with delivering training that will fundamentally transform the competency of the service. The shift with its 2 days and 2 nights on and 4 days off, limits available time. It ill-fits co-training with non-operational experts. It is particularly difficult to quality assure, especially if the watch managers have to be trainees, trainers, and supervisors of the training during shift hours without the training to do so. Overall, it makes significant change in the way things are done, particularly cumbersome to achieve. Taking all these matters together, the LFB remained a depressed learning environment before Grenfell. It was not an auspicious forum for change makers or particularly welcoming to blue sky thinking. You saw that in phase 1 with Peter Johnson's exercise that tested the readiness of command units to deal with multiple fire survivor calls. You will see a similar problem in this module with regard to research on the psychology of incident command. Modern organisations need to be places of ideas. That is the case even when, and indeed especially when, those organisations manage risk to life. Projects for change were not so much rejected as default, dampened down, or stalled in the system. The BSR, therefore, in consideration of these impediments of culture and training, they provide important root cause explanations as to why the LFB defaulted in its competencies in such a significant way at Grenfell Tower, and it is those deficiencies, as established in phase 1, that I now turn to. The first deficiency. Operational firefighters could not identify a cladding fire, even though it was long understood to pose potentially catastrophic risks. The evidence suggests a genuinely perverse disconnect between the identification of cladding systems being recognised as a high-rise fire danger for more than 30 years, but no one ever seriously suggesting that operational firefighters ought to be trained on the subject. Witnesses, core participants, and a note of counsel to the inquiry have set out the multiple references to the issue over time. We particularly mention the Select Committee report in 1999, the various versions of Generic Risk Assessment 3.2 in 2008 and 2014, the guidelines on the provision of operational risk information, otherwise known as PORUS, in 2013, and the 2014 National Operational Guidance Programme paper on fires in the built environment that highlighted external wall finish cladding and described the potential for external fire spread with combustible cladding systems. So it could be debated whether more should have been done by central government, but the hazard of cladding and other forms of external fire spread was identified in the national documents, but were never mainstreamed into LFB capability. Phase 2 disclosure shows that discussion of cladding fires took place in different sections of the LFB, but was never transferred to operational firefighters whose knowledge of the risk counted most. Chief amongst those failings was the various slide presentations on tall building facades that were adapted by members of the Fire Safety and Enforcement Department in 2015 to be delivered in training only to themselves, without anyone apparently thinking to translate the slides into a station-based package for fellow firefighters. During 2015, the leaders of operational policy, having completed GRA 3.2 in its revision and its translation into an updated local policy 633, attended various high-rise building sector conferences and emailed one another, during which the terrible examples of cladding fires were mentioned, but still not circulated to the organisation. It is an awful indictment of a fire service that its training and dialogue was so disjointed that this pocketed awareness of bad case scenarios was never joined up. The explanation of officers who knew about these cladding fires but did not educate their workplace about them is equally disappointing, even if revealing. They say that the details of the fires were too limited to learn anything from. But in an age of internet, emails and video conferencing, they did nothing to research their facts. They then say that they assumed, without actually knowing, that the regulatory framework and compliance cultures in these other countries would be less exacting than the UK and therefore little was thought to be gained. If these explanations are genuine, they amount to an admission of unacceptable closed-mindedness and constitute a fatal breach of health and safety obligations to inform, train and prepare. The LFB repeatedly presents itself as a world leader, but on this, the largest brigade in a significant global capital city, it is incongruously isolationist and parochial. The second deficiency at Grenfell Tower was that the LFB visits to the building before the fire woefully underassessed the risks it posed and the basic features of layout that needed to be known. Since 1947, fire services have been under a statutory duty to make arrangements to gather information to enable the discharge of their function. The terms of Section 72D of the Fire and Rescue Services Act 2004 do not change that requirement, albeit that for the first time, they explicitly state that the duty relates to both the putting out of fires as well as the protection of life and property from fire. Nevertheless, the duty erroneously remains downgraded in firefighting parlance as familiarisation visits. In fact, it ought to combine two things. First, preventative risk assessment, and second, the preparatory stage of operational response, such as to enable incident command and crews, if ever deployed, to have access to the right information when they need it. The content of the Operational Risk Database, or ORD, filled in by North Kensington Station for Grenfell, was so inadequate that it is difficult to believe that its flaws were not more widespread. The inquiry has already established the various gaps in the database, as well as the follow-up actions that were never completed. The incident command at Grenfell Tower duly had insufficient, wrong, or no information as to the number of floors, building plans, riser mains, lifts control, ventilation, radio testing, emergency contacts and residents. The recent inquiry expert report on water has disclosed that available fire hydrants, which would have made a difference in water flow, were missing from the ORD and never used. Based on the standardised LFB risk assessment system that prevailed at the time, Grenfell Tower scored the lowest possible category. This absolutely should not have been the case. After the Lackner House fire in 2009, the LFB became aware that the organisation was exposed. Its research acknowledged that degrees of building failure were relatively common and that the protection of building control under the building regulations and risk assessments under the fire safety order were insufficiently robust. In 2010, a national study known as Future Fires described securing compliance with fire safety as the biggest single concern to the sector. The LFB leadership therefore knew that the instability of the regulatory system was itself a generic hazard, particularly in relation to high-rise firefighting, and arguably its greatest threat. A report of December 2013, commissioned to comply with the Lackner House Action Plan, showed stations to be lacking in training or commitment to comply with the requirement of either the national or internal premises risk assessment policies. The problem was so great that the study advocated alteration of the service standards in order to sufficiently compel greater station compliance with the statutory duty. The Brigade's third officer in command, Assistant Commissioner Brown, effectively shelved that report and its recommendations, despite having previously informed the Lackner House Working Group that the LFB was compliant with the relevant policies and had met its Lackner House Action Plan commitments relating to Section 7.2d of the Act. It obviously had not. On this issue, the LFB demonstrates a profound ambivalence about what it expects of its members. The various LFB policies acknowledge the necessary connection between competent prior inspection and construction literate incident command. However, Commissioner Cotton's Phase 1 evidence chose to disavow the expectations of the policies because, in her words, frontline firefighters don't have the technical knowledge or ability to be able to do those things. To which the obvious responses are, if not, why, and whose fault is that? Whatever the success of preventative and preparatory measures in London, witnesses will tell this inquiry that premises assessment remained a perceived paperwork chore to be tolerated rather than lauded as an essential feature of the firefighting job. Firefighters likely got by without better information and knowledge because during standard fires, they did not need it. Radical solutions, including altering the shift system to prioritise inspection or transforming the structure of the organisation to truly realign its prevention function, were seen as too controversial to be pursued. Can I turn then to the third deficiency in the LFB response on the night? And that is the insecurities of the incident command system. We agree with others that without sufficient training, preparation and policy, the failings of the individual incident commanders were the failings of the organisation. But there is one particular aspect of those failings that demands real attention, and it concerns the extent to which the unusual but not unexpected features of the fire overwhelmed the commanders who looked at it. We want to suggest that the attempt by the LFB and other fire service corps participants to find only technical explanations for that failure will never work. And the reason for that is that the errors partly lie in human psychology and the over-tendency of the brain to compute what is experienced and recognisable and to overlook information that is not. For more than 50 years, behavioural psychologists have described this essential editing feature of the mind. It causes error when making decisions, especially under extreme pressure. It has been studied for the preparation of military battlefields and launch pads, airline cockpits, surgeons' operating tables, and other high-risk stress-related disciplines. It has become central to North American armed services doctrine, especially since the mistaken shooting down of an Iranian commercial airline flight by the USS Van Sands in 1988. And some of its central insights were achieved by research done on US fireground commanders in the 1990s. And yet, the LFB is still reluctant to recognise this as a core part of its own incident command training and doctrine. Instead, it stands by the decision-making model, or DMM, contained in its policy 341. The model assumes that in the heat of the moment, a commander is able to analyse in a form of straight-line reasoning that gathers and thinks about information, identifies objectives, plans their execution, communicates and controls the plan, evaluates the outcome upon execution, and then starts the cycle again. The problem with the model is that is just not how people think under pressure, especially during emergency incidents. In real-world settings, experimental research shows that their thinking is more reflexive than reflective. They rely on generalised appraisals and biases rather than optimum or exact judgments in their situational awareness, and especially so when the situation is dynamic, complex and stressful. And consequently, they do not generate and compare options. Asking Watch Manager Dowden to rely on this orthodox model of decision-making that was designed by business consultants in the 1940s for people sitting at desks with the luxury to contemplate solutions set him up not only to fail, but disabled him in his capacity to succeed. The evidence of Chief Officer Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton will show that by 2015, national guidance had come to accept that the older decision-making model was dangerous because it was counterintuitive and wrong. It advocated thereafter a new approach that controls the human tendency to simplify and prompts against our natural bias towards the familiar, hence its name, the Decision Control Process, or DCP. DCP contains 3 questions. 1, why am I doing this? 2, what do I think will happen? And 3, is the benefit proportionate to the risk? The DCP has been the subject of internationally peer-reviewed published research studies by Cardiff University that show it to produce 5 times greater effectiveness in command decision-making than the traditional LFB model. The authors of that research include Cohen-Hatton and group manager Phil Butler, Both of these peoples were pioneers in this country. To the great benefit of the LFB, both these career firefighters were working for the organisation in the years before Grenfell Tower. Still, their nationally adopted ideas were deemed by the brigade leadership to be too transformational, too much, too soon. The LFB is the only fire service in the country that did not adopt the DCP model. It is now used by all other London blue light services, even when it has national guidance and the country's leading experts available to make change happen. This is an organisation that still finds it extremely difficult to do anything other than remain the same. The fourth deficiency, evacuation. The basics still warrant repeating. Stay put is a principle of construction designed to limit the need to evacuate residents from tall buildings when it is unnecessary to do so. No more, no less. However, the Phase 1 report found that the principle had been allowed over time by the LFB to transform into an article of faith. The inquiry has now seen the foundation documents of the 1960s and 1970s through to the present BSI and PASS guidance. As long as stay put has existed as a concept, so has its limitations. It is reliant on effective compartmentation and envisages in any event that once affected by fire or smoke, residents need to get out through unencumbered means of escape. BSI 9991 also makes clear that the numbers, profile and disabilities of the resident population will be relevant to how long it takes to get out. It is ludicrous to operate under a default assumption that this will never happen. Compartmentation fails, doors don't close, works are not competent, contractors break the law, and so smoke and fire spread. The inquiry has already seen that the requirement for incident commanders to consider the need for evacuation was contained in national and local policy, but that the efficacy of the requirement was fatally compromised by the fact that there was no guidance as to how, in practical terms, this should be done. As far as the LFB was concerned, the how remained a chronically undeveloped doctrine and practice. The inquiry will hear from Dr. Grimwood about the alternative approach that was taught by Kent Fire Services to incident commanders from 2010 onward, which included the so-called ICE, later RICE technique. RICE stands for Rescue, Intervention, Containment, Escape. Its central premise is that it does not assume that compartmentation will hold or that residents will not self-evacuate. It also counsels against default engagement with the fire, deploying straight to intervention before establishing by rapid reconnaissance of the staircase that compartmentation can be operationally relied upon. By 2014, a group of southeastern regional fire services had developed joint operating procedure that identified 4 factors to consider when re-evaluating the pre-planned stay-put strategy. These are 1, fire development, 2, smoke travel, 3, self-evacuation, and 4, compromised staircase, all of which were witnessed, we should add, within the first minutes of the Grenfell fire by the commanders. The Kent trainer also envisages that the stairwell can split into sectors so as to facilitate conveyor belt staged evacuation. LFB has been developed since the Grenfell Tower fire to incorporate aspects of the Kent South East approach, including stairwell protection and dedicated monitoring, and identifying a set of triggers that would justify considered departure from stay put. The question is, why was that thinking not there previously? Broader way to look at it is, why was a technique that had been developed in training, assessment and firefighting in Kent since 2010, and before that in Malaysia, and then shared across other services, was so underappreciated by the LFB before the Grenfell Tower fire, given that it could have made a significant difference on the night. The evidence in Phase 1 included repeated assertions that evacuees would have been in panic and endanger themselves and firefighters. Several years on, no evidence has been disclosed to establish the solid empirical foundation to justify that fear. The likely reasons for that is that for several decades, those who have studied cryopsychology during disasters, including during fires and explosions such as the Summerland Resort, the King's Cross fire, and the collapse of the World Trade Center, have established that in moments of crisis, people tend to act in an unusually collaborative and bonded way, even with strangers, but especially when they are in familiar surroundings and with people who are known to them. We have cited a range of articles that emphatically make these points clear, including a research study of World Trade Center survivors led by Professor Ed Galea that was footnoted at the end of GRA 3.2 on high-rise firefighting. What is striking is how the Phase 1 evidence adds to that body of research. Even in great fear, people did not exhibit extreme, uncontrollable reactions. Despite the conditions, neither residents nor firefighters were physically hurt as a result of the evacuation. They may not have thought it at the time, but the evidence of survivors and even the recordings and texts of those who died overwhelmingly show them as prone to creative, cooperative, and life-saving initiative. This is the body of data that the initiative in this process has collected, and it is extraordinarily ad idem with the conventional wisdom that now exists in the academic research on behavioural psychology. Underneath its technical construction, origins, and policy justifications, we therefore want the inquiry to test an ostensibly more difficult contention about stay put. That this article of faith has developed as such because it is underpinned by a continuing fear and mythology about the panicking crowd. The consequences is that the firefighters see themselves as the rescuers in the story rather than facilitators of residents being the co-respondents in their own escape. Now, it is inevitable for a range of reasons that some buildings will need to be evacuated. On that, there existed a further unacceptable gap in doctrine, as Steve McGurk accepts, that there has never been any dedicated thinking around how to evacuate residents whose mobility is impaired, and there is still nothing of meaningful substance contained in the amended policies. That is the case even though the overall significant percentage of mobility impaired people in high-rise social housing buildings is well known, and it's also well known that it's growing given the ageing population. Without wishing to dilute the responsibility of the landlord to profile and better arrange for resident evacuation from its building, it cannot be right for the fire service to remain aloof from planning how they will facilitate a building evacuation if the emergency need arises. By virtue of their duties under Section 7.2d, fire services must also establish what plans the responsible person has made for vulnerable residents and consider taking enforcement action when there are none. The further deficiencies in the response to Grenfell Tower concern the communication system. The problem was not just the equipment, but the way in which it was used and the manner in which incident command, the fireground sectors, and the control room communicated. All parts of the system were overwhelmed. The issues relating to the control room and fire survival guidance will be dealt with in Module 6. Professor Johnson has also provided the inquiry with an in-depth description of the technical deficiencies of the available radio equipment, especially the BA radios. We want to draw your attention to Professor Johnson's emphasis that the effectiveness of communications is not about the equipment alone, but the overall quality of the communication system and the organisational culture that procures and utilises the equipment. What is at stake for a communication system at a fireground is the achievement of situational awareness. Johnson provides a general definition as the ability of individuals and teams to perceive information in their environment, to interpret and comprehend the meaning of that information, and then use it in a way that helps anticipate future events and hence informs their subsequent actions. The conclusion of the expert is that the LFB put up with and makes do with the defective radio equipment because most of the time they don't need it. Crews are deployed, they put out the fire, and they say what they've done. That is until the incident becomes huge and complex. Those who witnessed the Phase 1 evidence will recall the profound lack of situational awareness, especially by incident and sector commanders throughout the night. The problem lay in part with the equipment, but it also lay in the quality of the interpersonal communications at the fireground and with the control room. There is an important emergency concept called crew resource management, or CRM. It places a premium on interpersonal communications amongst teams in high-stress situations. The absence of developed CRM organisational culture within the LFB is relevant to the failure at the Grenfell incident ground. There were points, especially in the window of opportunity before 2 a.m., when experienced firefighters like Station Manager Egan did not speak up when they believed that the building needed to be evacuated. And when they did speak up, they were not heard, as appears to have been the case with MOCH Management Harrison. Speaking up for those in support roles and listening up for those in leadership are skills. The failings in this area, including that the LFB doesn't teach these skills, are likely to relate to the extent to which the organisation remains inflexibly against speaking up in its hierarchies, even though other disciplined vocations, including the cockpit, the operating room and military launch pads, have made it professionally safe and indeed a duty to do so. There is now a real question as to whether the final deficiency in the LFB response concerns the competency in the use of water. It is important that the BSR wait for the informed explanation of others, and yet it is equally right that they should articulate their concerns at this stage. Until the recent service of Dr. Ivan Stoyanov's report, it was thought that the non-availability of the taller 42-metre ladder was the critical issue as to the absent water equipment during most of the fire. It is now suggested that there was equipment present that might have made a difference, but for the lack of institutional knowledge on how best to use it. If the expert is correct, then water from the ground monitor situated on Grenfell Walk was capable of reaching the 15th floor, and all the available aerial pumps were capable of launching water to the top of the building. Both of these things are said not to have happened because of a fundamental misunderstanding of the technical features of water supply and a consequential failure to alter incident strategies to secure greater water flow. This is an extraordinary possibility for the BSR to have to contemplate 4 years after the fire. The Phase 1 evidence tragically indicates that it is unlikely that greater water supply and more aerial pumps and monitors would have prevented the upward vertical spread of the fire or its horizontal spread across the crown at the top of the building. Yet the evidence of the success achieved by the ground monitor on the raised section of Grenfell Walk does suggest that there was a strong correlation between water supply and containment of downward fire spread. This is what happened with the partial containment of the fires on floor 10 and 11. It enabled the late rescues of Antonio Roncolata from flat 72 at 6:05 in the morning and Elpidio Bonifacio from flat 83 at 8:07. The fact that the families of Natasha Elcock from flat 82 and Anne Chance from flat 73 also survived until rescue in the later hours of the fire attests to the combination that external water provided as a containment function until BA crews arrived. That is why we are bound to raise again the fate of flat 113, 3 floors above on the same side of the building, where there was proof of life until 4:06 a.m., just before the flat became engulfed in fire at 4:09. The inquiry is well aware of missed opportunities earlier in the night to rescue those who took shelter in flat 113. This new evidence on water adds a potential additional reason as to why this flat and this floor stand out as the paradigm of preventable death. Panel, we are moving into the final modules of this inquiry. There is considerable evidence now that Britain currently has an unstable fire regulatory system. But it also has a fire service that is incompetent to meet contemporary challenges. Both of those matters need fixing. And until that happens, those who live in high-rise social housing will continue to be at significant risk. Grenfell Tower showed them least likely to be protected from fire and most likely to be dependent on effective fire service response. The LFB was brave at Grenfell Tower, but it was not effective. There is a time and a place in this inquiry to deal with deregulation and austerity, but the fire service leadership and the fire brigade union need to be far more introspective than they currently are in acknowledging how they can be more part of the solution rather than the problem. Professor Torreira's opinion is that without a radical change in structure, culture and competency, then things will remain the same. What he says brings into question that the present model of fire response is an unqualified heroic good. In particular, he contests society's traditional comfort in neighbourhood fire stations and the retention of an orthodox frontline shift system. The evidence of decades of reviews tells us that the sector will never lead itself out of these current deficiencies, and therefore what is required is a long-term, ongoing, multidisciplinary national transformation process. It should include fire service personnel, but must be led by others. For the BSR, the question of reform can no longer be a closed conversation. The panel will have to decide how much it will prompt these endeavours, but as with other aspects of this once-in-a-generation inquiry, if not now, when?
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Friedman. Now, the next statement is going to be made by Professor Thomas, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of other bereaved survivors and residents. Good morning, Mr. Thomas.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, panel. It's been said that you rise above your fears by facing them, not ignoring them. In our society, we've been brought up to respect and to be grateful for firefighters for what they do for us. It does not come naturally to us to criticise their actions. They are held in high esteem by the public as frontline workers who bravely put their lives at risk for others and who are here to protect and serve us. They act with impressive selflessness. So, our criticism of the London Fire Brigade does not detract from the individual acts of bravery of firefighters, nor does it detract from the solidarity of individual firefighters with the bereaved resident survivors of the Grenfell community. But Grenfell is not just a story of individual heroism and bravery. It is a tragedy fraught with systemic failings, neglect, and a culture of organisation, of fustigation. Individuals may have been brave, but was the LFB wise? The LFB as a public body has a duty of accountability and should act with candour. in its responses to this inquiry. Indeed, it is only through acknowledging the causes and consequences of its failings can the LFB make meaningful change. The London Fire Commissioner's opening submissions on behalf of the LFB lack the contrition and introspection needed to truly rise above and learn from the LFB's failings on the 14th of June 2017, which, as we have seen and heard during Phase 1, are reflective of systemic failings. The failure of the LFB to appropriately be critical of its response to the fire at Grenfell Tower constitutes a great disservice to those who lost their lives, those who lost loved ones, those who lost their homes, and indeed the wider Grenfell community. The LFB's failure to adequately address their organisation's failings is disappointing to the BSRs, who view this as an attempt to ignore fault. So, how can I assist you? The ask, the questions. As Grenfell Tower burnt before the world's eyes, action, and in some quarters radical action, was needed and well overdue. We hope that during the course of this module, this inquiry will investigate how it came to be that the LFB was so ill-equipped to respond to the fire at Grenfell, and why the LFB abjectly failed in its dynamic risk assessment. We say that there are at least 8 questions that need to be answered by the LFB. Number 1, why was there a failure to learn lessons from Lakanal House? Number 2, were there deficiencies in the training across the LFB, and was this systemic? Number 3, what was the impact of austerity, cuts and deregulation on the LFB in the years preceding Grenfell fire, and the LFB's response to this? Number 4, why were the Section 72D visits to Grenfell Tower so deficient? Number 5, how did essential communications fail at Grenfell Tower, and why was the technology so inadequate? Number 6, why did the London Fire Brigade fail to follow its own policies? Number 7, were there systemic failings within the LFB that impacted on their response to the Grenfell Tower fire? And number 8, why did incident commanders fail to recognise that the Grenfell Tower was a failing building and that the stay put advice was untenable? Now, those are 8 broad questions we've come up with. I'm sure your team will have questions of its own. Structure of our submissions. In these oral submissions, we intend to address the points raised by the other CPs in their opening written submissions. You'll be pleased to know that we do not intend to repeat our written submissions. I might touch upon them just on occasion to refer to their content. As we outlined in our written submissions for this module, there are central themes that pervade all the topics to be addressed, most notably the LFB's culture, the LFB's failure to learn lessons, austerity and deregulation. In our submission, it is essential to fairly contextualise the LFB's failings at Grenfell prior to and on the night, the spectre of austerity and massive cuts to the LFB's budget, retrenchment and closures of fire stations loomed large over the organisation and undoubtedly negatively impacted on equipment, resources, training, and the failures to learn lessons from previous fires and incidents. Matters were further compounded by a deep-rooted and pervasive culture of intransigence and an unwillingness to change and develop. Culture. My learned friend, Mr. Friedman of Queen's Counsel, has spoken at length about the issue of culture and the manner in which it affected the LFB's ability to prepare for a fire like the one at Grenfell Tower. Sir, we agree wholeheartedly with those submissions, and we agree that the LFB's culture permeates all strands of its unpreparedness. Its blinkered response to the fire resulted in the failure of the incident commanders prior to, now Commissioner Andy Rowe, to consider the earlier abandonment of stay put and the failure to engage with or consider an evacuation plan. This is, in our respectful submission, evidence of the Brigade's cultural resistance to change and the technical knowledge and innovation, as well as an embedded weakness in the organisational training and structure. It's of no surprise that the Brigade's response was woefully deficient, both on the incident ground and in the control room. We agree and adopt Professor Torrero's opinion on the issue, namely that at the heart of the inadequate dynamic risk assessment conducted during the Grenfell Tower fire was a, quote, fundamental misunderstanding among all command ranks, that the primary role of the fire and rescue services is to fight fires, and that if a fire cannot be fought, there is no alternative path of action or role that. Professor Torrero notes that this misconception is a, quote, key weakness of the training and structure of the London Fire Brigade. It is important to note that our clients and the public do not expect perfection. For we are not perfect beings. We make mistakes. We make mistakes all of the time. But all we can do is try to learn from our mistakes, take responsibility for them, and do a better job tomorrow. The question here is whether the fire service is exempt from that standard which we hold to ourselves. I fear the answer is a resounding no. Deflection of responsibility. Vika Runwell once said, honest self-reflection opens the door to reprogramming, change, success, and freedom, end quote. Dear panel, the written submissions of the LFB make for very disappointing reading in this regard. The LFB repeatedly state in their written submissions that ultimately it was not responsible for the causes of the fire or the manner in which it developed. The LFB points the finger at the building contractors, product manufacturers, as well as the TMO and building control. Of course, we do not dispute responsibility of those involved in the refurbishment and the management of Grenfell Tower. The evidence from modules 1 to 3 has indeed been shocking and damning, nor do we say that the LFB in any way caused the fire. However, the fact that others played the primary role in the causes of the fire does not absolve the LFB of its responsibilities and obligations. Its response to the fire and its preparation for a fire at Grenfell Tower have to be held up to the cold light of scrutiny, and, where wanting, those deficiencies must be exposed and thereafter acknowledged and rectified by the Brigade. Joining in the chorus of disapproval of the egregious behaviour of the corporate call participants does not make the LFB's failings disappear. The organisation must apply some critical thinking and introspection in order to ameliorate its own ills. Lest we forget, as we start this module, that Inquiry's Phase 1 report was incredibly critical of the LFB for the manner in which it prepared for and its response to the fire at Grenfell Tower. Yet, almost 2 years on from that report, the London Fire Commissioner's open statement contains limited acknowledgement and acceptance of the LFB's failings. One would have thought that an organisation whose actions were so heavily criticised would be humbled and be prepared to take ownership of mistakes. The LFB's deflection of responsibility, despite the weight of the evidence to the contrary, further illuminates how the LFB came to not implementing any substantial lessons from previous fires and in high-rise buildings. It also raises real public safety concerns about the willingness of the London Fire Brigade to learn lessons from the Grenfell Tower fire, as well as its commitment to the safety of Londoners. The lack of contrition is frankly insulting to the bereaved, residents, survivors of the Grenfell community. We know that the LFB is not a monolith. There were some alternative voices raised that challenged the orthodox and accepted LFB positions, as evidenced by some in the firefighting testimony in Phase 1. However, the prevailing lack of self-reflection and self-awareness of the LFB is, quite frankly, a kick in the teeth to the rank and file firefighters who risked all to go up several flights of smoke-filled stairwells as the fire raged and enveloped the tower. The stance adopted in the LFB's opening submission risks long-term damage to the reputation of its organisation. It is because of the goodwill and the high regard in which the London Fire Brigade is held in the public conscience that we expect better from them rather than empty platitudes. How can the public have faith in the institution if it's unwilling to accept responsibility for widely acknowledged mistakes and failings? Accepting and understanding mistakes is a key feature of learning lessons, and we agree with the Mayor of London, who said in his opening submissions, namely, quote, "The most important outcome for the bereaved survivors and residents, and indeed for all Londoners, is that the lessons of Grenfell are learnt and progress quickly so that they can be reassured that the terrible events of that night will not be repeated," end quote. Can the BSRs be confident that lessons are being learnt? Once again, the answer must be a resounding no. The written submissions of the London Fire Brigade alarmingly demonstrate that it is not an organisation that is undertaking meaningful introspection in response to the fire and the Phase 1 findings. Notwithstanding the fact that the LFB in their written submissions say that they have been involved in the process of, quote, assessing LFB policy, procedure and training to reflect the learning from the Grenfell Tower fire, end of quote, and that this is being done recognising the need to demonstrate that the LFB is a learning organisation committed to continuous improvement, their unwillingness to accept their own failings renders this hollow. That passage could have been cut and pasted from the myriad declarations, policy documents, circulars generated post-Lacanau. However, the hand-wringing, the mea culpas are no substitute for decisive action. You see, our clients and the Grenfell community have not forgotten the evidence of ex-Commissioner Cotton, who infamously stated that even with the benefit of hindsight, she would not have done anything differently on the night of the fire, and that she would not train firefighters for a cladding fire any more that she would train them, quote, for a space shuttle landing on the Shard. Many of the BSRs said in their evidence to this inquiry that they wanted change to make sure that what happened to them and their families never happened again. Hanan Wahabi, whose brother and his wife and 3 children died in the fire, said, quote, "It was very upsetting to hear Danny Cotton say that she would not have done anything different on the night. This is like saying there are no lessons to be learned. I know that people tried their best, but mistakes were made. Saying that they would not do anything differently cannot be an acceptable response if we are serious about learning. 72 people passed away, and we can't bring our loved ones back." That public bodies are unwilling to engage in meaningful retrospection is not surprising to us lawyers who work in this field. There's a long history of public bodies resisting such introspection until forced to do so. And when forced to do so, dragging their feet to meet recommendations. It is for this very reason that families have pressed for public officials and those organisations acting in the public interest to act with candour. The reticence is emblematic of a culture that Professor Terrero describes as incapable of reform from within. We know that change can sometimes mean venturing into the unknown and leaving behind that which is comfortable, familiar and routine. The fear of the new. This can be problematic in an individual, but catastrophic in a large public organisation. Cultural inertia within a public organisation such as the LFB is short-sighted and dangerous. As Professor Terrero astutely and succinctly opines, quote, "The creation of a culture that rebalances priorities is necessary to promote acquisition of skills and attributes essential for the fire and rescue services to operate in a modern built environment. The new culture requires a profound reformulation of hierarchy within the LFB that enables those with the appropriate skills and attributes to conduct plan formulation, to progress in the command structure. Currently, this culture does not exist, and the LFB command shows a strong bias towards those individuals who have demonstrable skills and attributes when it comes to the consistent repetition of predefined protocol." That lessons will be learned is a phrase so often used and abused after tragedies and disasters, when the public gaze is still bright and hand-wringing and platitudes are plentiful. However, its meaning has become diminished and treated with often justifiable scepticism. It is a phrase which sadly history has often shown to be hollow. Far from being learnt, lessons are ignored, disregarded, and failings ultimately repeated. Lacanau. One of the most shocking aspects of the LFB's failure of preparedness for the Grenfell fire is that lessons should have been learned from the Lakanal house fire in 2009, which, if addressed properly and taken seriously, may have prevented this disaster. Although not like for like, the similarities between the two fires are striking. On the 3rd of July 2009, a faulty television caused a fire to break out on the 9th floor of Lakanal House in Camberwell, in South London. The building was a high-rise residential block, some 42 metres tall, containing 98 flats and masonettes spread over 14 floors. The fire spread via the exterior cladding made up of HPL composite panels, which were found to be non-compliant with building regulations. 6 people died in that fire, including 3 children. Inquests were held, and at their conclusion in March 2013, Assistant Deputy Coroner Her Honour Francis Kirkham, CBS, sent recommendations in a Rule 43 letter to Mr. Ron Dobson, the then Fire Commissioner. These recommendations covered Section 7.2D visits, fire safety awareness for the public, instant commanders, brigade control, and communications at major incidents. The inquiry's Phase 1 report found, quote, "The evidence heard in the inquiry at Phase 1 shows that despite changes to certain LFB organisational policies and the introduction of new training packages, few, if any, lessons were learnt by the LFB. The evidence concerning the LFB's failure to learn the lessons of Lakanal House will be heard across Modules 5 and 6. In Module 5, the inquiry will hear how the LFB failed to implement the recommendations relating to the Section 7.2D visits, incident command policies and procedures, and radio communications. The inquiry will explore the failure to disseminate knowledge of these changes through appropriate training. In Module 6, the inquiry will hear evidence about the changes to national guidance following Lakanal and the LFB's failure to fully incorporate these provisions into their own local policies, about the introduction of the fire survival guidance policy and the failure to regularly refresh the training of control staff on handling of important calls, and the missed opportunities to introduce fire safety measures in high-rise buildings through the retrofitting of sprinklers. The common themes in the failure to learn these lessons are a defensive culture within the LFB's top-tier management, who had battened down the hatches when faced with criticisms from the Coroner's Court and the DCLG following Lakanal, and a fire and rescue service whose workers are stretched to breaking point by chronic underfunding, staff shortages, ineffective training, and threats of privatisation. Stay put, and the failure following that. Given that around 150 people were self-evacuated during Lakanal house fire, a review of the attachment to the stay put doctrine was necessary. Further, given that the vast majority of the occupants of Grenfell Tower who self-evacuated on the night of the fire did so before the stay put advice was abandoned at 02:47, and that the vast majority of those who died at Grenfell did so after being advised directly or indirectly to stay put, it is rather astonishing, and to compound insult to the families and the Grenfell community, that in their written opening submissions, both the LFB and the FBU defend the decisions of the first instant fire commanders not to revoke stay put. This is despite the finding of you, sir, in Phase 1 to the contrary. This position reflects a lack of appreciation that sometimes the tried and tested methods need to be changed. It also reflects organisational inertia and stagnation. that the LFB has not accepted the failings of the incident command on the night, which contributed to the loss of life. In effect, instead of facing its fear, it's chosen to ignore it. It is clear that the stay put remains an article of faith for the London Fire Brigade. It is unclear, though, how this marries up with the LFB's supposedly newfound appreciation of the risk of compartmentation failures and the risk of combustible cladding in high-rise buildings. There is a disconnect here. On the 12th of February of 2020, Andy Rowe agreed the revised high-rise firefighting policy 633 for the LFB, stating, quote, "The LFC has a legal obligation to equip and train its firefighters so far as reasonably practicable for what is now a foreseeable risk, as well as an obligation to Londoners to provide a service that will make all reasonable attempts to save lives, including in circumstances as extreme as those experienced on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire," end quote. The risk of external fire spread was a foreseeable risk by 2017, before 2017, which the London Fire Brigade was fully aware of. However, they failed to make or have any adequate plans or training in place to respond to cladding fires. Once again, the LFB comes across as an organisation reluctant to take ownership of its own lack of preparedness for the Grenfell Tower fire, this time in relation to its own knowledge of the risk posed by the cladding and the failures of compartmentation. The saying goes that failing to prepare is preparing to fail. One simply cannot hope for the best without planning for the worst. Once again, the findings of the Lakanal House inquest are prescient. On the 28th of March 2013, the Lakanal House coroner wrote to Mr. Ron Dobson and emphasised, amongst other things, that consideration be given to training of incident commanders to enhance their performance in relation to the following: the dynamic risk assessment model, other management tools to enable commanders to analyse the situation and recognise and react quickly to the changing circumstances, to anticipate that the fire might behave in a manner that is inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. In 2007, before the findings of the Lakanal House inquest, the Home Office document Fighting Fires in High-Rise Building version 1.8 referred to the development of contingency plans for a range of foreseeable events, including fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, communication failure, and lift failure. You see, there's evidence to suggest that the London Fire Brigade knew that there was more than a negligible risk of a serious fire in a high-rise building with a cladding system. At the very least, the London Fire Brigade ought to have known about the risks posed by combustible cladding due to an awareness of cladding fires in the UK and abroad. So you concluded in phase 1, quote, "Notwithstanding the history of fires involving cladding systems, the LFB's experience and assessment of the Shepherd's Court fire in August 2016 and the letter to the chief executives of the London boroughs, very few, if any, of the incident commanders or senior officers who attended the fire at Grenfell were aware of the risks posed by exterior cladding. Certainly none of them received any training in recognising or assessing risks of that kind, or in the steps that should have been taken in response to a fire in the envelope of a high-rise building," end of quote. Professor Torero reinforced your view, sir, by stating, quote, "Given the recent history of large facade fires, the evolution of the fire at Grenfell Tower was foreseeable, and that there was an awareness within the London Fire Brigade of these fires and their potential consequences." Dear panel, this inquiry heard evidence during phase 1 about the tall building facades presentation, which was discussed with previous cladding fires, mechanisms of external fire spread, regulations, the Shepherd Court fire, and the need to understand what products was used in the facade system. The oral evidence in this module needs to explore why this presentation was only showed to a few senior officers. Why wasn't this information shared across the board? At the time of the Grenfell fire, the London Fire Brigade's standing policy on high-rise building firefighting, number 633, had not been amended to take into account BRE 135, nor was it amended to take into account the Brigade's own tall building facades presentation or the Lakenhall House coroner's report. This is a failing on the part of the LFB as an institution to equip its firefighters with the knowledge of the risk of cladding fires and train on how to identify and respond to cladding fires. Cladding fires and external fire spread from cladding was not a new phenomenon. I repeat, not a new phenomenon. Indeed, there had been cladding fires in the UK and around the world before Grenfell fire. Commissioner Rowe's comment that cladding fires are now, quote, now a foreseeable risk after Grenfell is inaccurate and misleading. Alarmingly, a note appended to the revised policy 633 said that, quote, clearly a more detailed and dedicated thinking is still required within the brigade, end quote. It's astonishing that even after the deaths of 72 people in Grenfell Tower fire, the LFB cannot clearly set out a detailed and unequivocal policy about this issue. Why? While the London Fire Commissioner acknowledges the need for the LFB's policies and procedures to be informed by international fires in modern high-rise buildings, on the one hand, it continues to justify its failings at Grenfell fire by asserting that these fires were in different jurisdictions and operated under different regulatory regimes. And you heard Mr. Friedman of Queen's Counsel on that point earlier on. This qualification once again rings hollow. It is possible to appreciate that different regulatory contexts exist across different jurisdictions, while simultaneously appreciating the obvious dangers posed by multiple cladding fires. In the face of overwhelming evidence, the London Fire Brigade cannot in good faith argue that it was unaware of the cladding fires in the UK and abroad, so that the only reasonable conclusion is that the London Fire Brigade did not deem it necessary to amend its existing policy and training and response. And we ask you to question, why was that? Let me come on to training. Phase 1 highlighted deficiencies in the LFB's training prior to the fire, perhaps most egregiously in the case of the incident command training. The Phase 1 report was highly critical of the absence of any training for incident commanders on how to recognise the need for evacuation, which in turn reflects a failure to recognise the risks of the fire taking hold on the outside of modern buildings. The Phase 1 report found that, quote, there was a failure to educate firefighters in the dangers associated with combustible cladding systems, which was surprising given the long history of fires involving cladding on high-rise buildings both in this country and abroad, with a history which some senior figures within the LFB were aware. The LFB have argued that it's essentially the lack of training in relation to the evacuation for its incident commanders was partly due to, quote, despite the provisions of GRA 3.2, there's never been any national operational guidance as to how to manage the full or partial evacuation of a high-rise building with a stay-put strategy, or to deviate from any other planned evacuation strategies which might apply to high-rise buildings, end quote. Whilst there may indeed have been an inadequate guidance from central government, this absence of guidance cannot justify the absence of internal training. Surely the London Fire Brigade should have attempted to guide their own staff on the matter. After all, GIR 3.2 did contemplate evacuation. Did the London Fire Brigade raise their concerns with central government about the lack of guidance? If they didn't, why didn't they? The issues associated with training were not limited to evacuation of high-rise cladding fires. The Phase 1 report and the expert evidence since have found significant deficiencies in training in the control room, Section 72D visits and communications. However, in their opening submissions, the London Fire Brigade argue that, quote, following its refurbishment, Grenfell Tower was a tragedy waiting to happen. The stay-put tragedy was fatally undermined as soon as the rain screen cladding system was installed. The building control and the London Fire Brigade should have been informed of the increased fire risks associated with rain screen cladding system, and ultimately there should not have been any residents living in the resulting death trap. Firefighters and control staff should never have had to respond to a fire in the Grenfell Tower, ignorant of these increased fire risks, without the necessary policy, preparation and training, end quote. We couldn't agree more. It relates to what the experts Steve McGuirk and Professor Terrera has identified as human error psychology, namely the inability to deal with something adequately that you do not recognise. And again, Mr. Freeman has already touched upon this. But the brigade bears significant responsibility for putting their own employees at considerable risk without the necessary knowledge and training to do the job, because they had the information. We know that Dr. Cohen-Hatton faced resistance within the brigade as she attempted to make improvements to the incident command training. Our clients would like to know the reasons behind this and whether the missed opportunities to learn from her best practice contributed to the failures of command and control on the night of the fire. Ultimately, this inquiry will have to ask the question, given the failures, were there deaths which could have been avoided? Were there lives that could have been saved? Cuts. The link between cuts and austerity and the fire safety being compromised and eroded is real. If an organisation is understaffed and underfunded, its ability to act efficiently is likely to be compromised. Our clients find common ground with the Fire Brigades Union on this point, whose warnings went unheard in the decades before the disaster, as the London Fire Brigade experienced the worst cuts imposed on any fire service in modern history. One of the impacts of the cuts was the reduction in staff in the control room. On the night of the fire, there were fewer control room officers on duty to handle the 999 calls and the fire survival guidance calls. There were fewer supervisors able to monitor how these calls were being handled and to ensure that the information was passed on the ground. In some cases, this meant that vital information about people who were trapped and could not self-evacuate was not passed on to firefighters at the tower, with fatal consequences. We echo the call of the Fire Brigades Union that the inquiry must investigate the decisions made by the former Mayor of London to impose stringent cuts on the brigade during Module 6. Our clients are clear in their assertions that Prime Minister Boris Johnson, when he was the Mayor of London, had a cruel agenda for cutting the fire brigade's budget, firefighters' numbers and stations. Let me remind you, this was a man who showed contempt for fire safety and the lives of Londoners, when in the face of legitimate political debate and criticism of his reckless policies, he told Labour Assembly member Andrew Dismore to, quote, get stuffed, close quote. His agenda directly impacted on the London Fire Brigade's ability to discharge its statutory duty. Sadiq Khan commissioned a review in 2016 when he became mayor. The review was unequivocal that the Fire Brigade could not sustain any more cuts if it was to have sufficient resources to meet the challenges of the future to keep Londoners safe. The Mayor's Module 5 written submissions state that he has been funding the London Fire Brigade at levels higher than those to which he is resourced by central government. We say it is alarming that he felt the need to use his own submissions to plead for further investment in the London Fire Brigade. The fact is, we have serious concerns about the attitude of central government. The written submissions of the Home Office, while acknowledging its overall responsibility for fire and rescue policy in England, is silent on the issues of funding, cuts and deregulation. We urge this inquiry to return to this important issue in Module 6 and to make recommendations to address what we consider to be an urgent issue. Further cuts of 15% of the London Fire Brigade's budget to 2020 were set out in the local government settlement. Despite the Grenfell Tower fire, no additional funding has been found for fire and rescue services. We fear that the London Fire Brigade will not be in a position to learn lessons from the Grenfell Tower fire without the resources to implement the necessary changes. Above all else, our clients don't want other families to go through what they have been through, but without proper funding, we fear the past may repeat itself. I've nearly finished. Communication. Communication is another aspect of the Brigade's response that, among other things, was arguably impacted by lack of resources. Communications within the Brigade broke down at the Grenfell Tower fire. The ability of the firefighters to speak to each other, the bridgehead and/or the incident commander was severely compromised. Vital information from the FSG calls was left to the vagaries of paper notes being passed to runners, to the bridgehead, and presumably back to the incident commands. This is in spite of the LFB policy 488 on incident communications, which states, quote, "Effective communications are the key to success. A reliable communication network is essential for safe operation at incidents and fundamental for securing the level of command required to manage operational resources effectively," end quote. In the opinion of expert witness Professor Johnson, the significant communication problems on the night of the Grenfell fire placed lives both of the firefighters and of the residents at risk. It seems impossible to avoid the conclusion that costs, saving, cutting influenced the Brigade's decision not to upgrade its communications equipment earlier. In Phase 1, Ricky Nuttall said, quote, "I know there's better equipment out there and I understand it's all about costs, but in this situation, costs shouldn't come into it," close quote. We endorse Professor Johnson's recommendation for the LFB, namely the need for cultural change from make and do with the legacy of information technologies to technical excellence. With other aspects of the LFB's inadequate response to the Grenfell Tower, the failure of communication seems to be one affected by culture that is resistant to change and innovation. We endorse Professor Johnson's recommendation to understand why so many innovative proposals from the Brigade staff were dismissed, and more generally, the resistance to technical innovation by the Brigade. Communication failure featured in Lakanal House fire. Problems with radio coverage, interference and congestion also affected the Brigade's response to Lakanal House. These problems were repeated on the night of the fire at Grenfell, and our clients would like to know why. So let me conclude. We welcome the London Fire Brigade submissions that they have been looking into evacuation and stay put since Grenfell Tower fire. And we too are alarmed by the continued lack of national guidance and consensus. This is a matter that is urgent and needs to be addressed at a national level. Central government must not drag its feet any longer. The overall message we would wish to convey on behalf of our clients is that the evidence and disclosure to date in this inquiry demonstrates that the Brigade is an institution in urgent need of reform. Our clients are concerned that the London Fire Brigade is an institution incapable of reforming itself from within. Professor Torreira argued that the current culture of the Fire Brigade fire and rescue services does not allow for the required level of self-criticism and introspection, end quote. As such, our clients ask that you, sir, and your panel keep under review the need for the overhaul of the London Fire Brigade from the outside. Given the implications for public safety, this overhaul cannot wait. Our clients want to ensure that others do not experience what they went through. We all want and need a fire service that is fit for purpose in the 21st century. This is not an insurmountable goal, but it is one that requires more than just goodwill and paper policies. There must be a genuine sea change in the culture of the LFB. At governmental level, there must be a realisation that bodies such as the London Fire Brigade are public services, not just businesses. Safety and lives cannot be sacrificed at the altar of austerity. The London Fire Brigade must be properly funded and resourced in order to underpin those changes in training, learning, practice development that are so desperately needed. The structure and makeup of the leadership must change. They need to listen, to be humble, to understand that the righteous indignation of those who suffered as a result of this disaster. The London Fire Brigade must and can do better for the sake of its members and the wider society. The safety of Londoners requires it. The residents and survivors of Grenfell Tower demand it. The memory of the deceased deserve it. I started this address, sir, with these words: you rise above your fears by facing them, not ignoring them. The LFB chose to ignore them. So let me finish with these words. Conan Doyle once said, "It's easy to be wise after the event." But this quote has absolutely no place or applicability here, because this is not a case of critics being wise with hindsight. The LFB should have been much wiser before the Grenfell Tower fire, but this organisation chose or was incapable of doing otherwise. We state clearly and unequivocally that, in this case, accordingly, this inquiry should not allow the excuse of hindsight to be used when everything that we have said was foreseeable all along. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Thomas. At this stage, we'll take the morning break and we'll resume at midday with the next statement. Thank you very much. Good, thank you. Now, the next statement we're going to hear is going to be made by Mr. Imran Khan, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of those whom he represents. Yes, Mr. Khan.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm recovering from a sore throat, so if my voice fails me, my apologies. And
Well,
you can't hear me.
take your own time, and there is water there, and if you need any more, please just indicate and we'll get some for you.
Very grateful. Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon, panel. Pleasure to be here. I make submissions, opening submissions on behalf of our clients, represented by Imran Khan and partners. Chair, it's often said that when tragedies occur, they could have been avoided had we known then what we know now. And in relation to the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire, our clients invite the inquiry to ask the question, what did the London Fire Brigade know before and at the time of the fire at Grenfell that took the lives of 72 people? And could that knowledge have saved lives, even one life? In our submission, we set out what we understand through the disclosure that the London Fire Brigade knew and should have known, which might have assisted in saving the lives of those on the night of the fire. We set out information which we consider was available to the London Fire Brigade, the LFB, before the Grenfell Tower fire, and we set out what the LFB failed to implement despite the information available to them, and where possible, how this related to the night of the fire. So the training of firefighters, what they need to be trained on, is identified by a commissioning department within the LFB or by a third-party training provider, Babcock. From 2012, the majority of LFB firefighters received their training from Babcock. Borough commanders, watch managers and station managers retain the responsibility for ensuring that firefighters within their borough had sufficient training. Regardless of who identified the requirements of training, it would proceed via the Training Commissioning Alteration process, known as TCAP, which was then followed. Up to and including June 2017, once a training requirement had been identified, a TCAP form was completed. The Operational Directorate's Coordination Board, a bit of a mouthful, also known as ODCB, identified and agreed what further training was required for LFB operational staff. And those needs would be communicated to staff through their operational news publication. So, sir, panel members, that was, in very brief, the system in place for the training of firefighters. So I go back to the original question. So what did the LFB know through its training? Well, it was established in phase one of the inquiry that senior staff within the LFB were aware of previous fires involving combustible cladding systems. But, it would seem, it failed to adequately train operational staff to recognise or assess the risks that they posed and the steps that should have been taken by way of response. My learned friend Mr. Thomas, Queen's Counsel, has already mentioned the Lakanal house fire. Well, the Lakanal house fire and the subsequent recommendations made by the coroner in that case will be dealt with in detail in Module 6. However, the fire illustrates a specific example of the failure of the LFB to educate and train its operational staff on the hazards of external cladding systems on high-rise buildings, despite its knowledge on the subject. The LFB were aware of the role of the external panels in the fire, and we have seen considerable evidence to indicate this. And we've addressed it in detail in our written submissions, and we don't intend to repeat it here. We know that Mr. David Crowder of the Building Research Establishment prepared a presentation on the Lakanal house fire, which referred to the use of composite external wall panels. The presentation was produced in collaboration with former Deputy Assistant Commissioner Gary Reason, former Commissioner Ron Dobson, and Assistant Commissioner Steve Turek of the LFB. Ms. Rita Dexter, who was Deputy Commissioner of the LFB, stated in her witness statement to the inquiry that the presentation made and I quote, a very significant impression, end quote, on her. As it detailed refurbishment projects which had, quote, the unintended consequence of diminishing fire safety protections of the building. In 2014, as part of the LFB's response to the Lackland House coroner's recommendations, they raised a TCAP, number 0153. It was called the Lackland House Training Case Study. The LFB draft PowerPoint presentation, however, made no reference to the cladding or exterior wall panels. The Babcock Training Guide, entitled Lackland House Case Study, does not refer to cladding or exterior wall panels, and the LFB PowerPoint presentation does not refer to them either. In addition to Lackland, there were national and international cladding fires of which senior staff in the LFB were aware, as demonstrated through a consideration of their correspondence. These fires took place after the Lackland House fire in 2009 and before the Shepherd's Court fire in 2016, which we deal with separately. In our written submissions, we've dealt in detail with the following cladding fires: Madingley, Dorrington Point, Sainsbury's Distribution Centre, Balearic Capital East Apartments, Andrew Reed House, and the fatal fire at Atherstone Industrial Estate. We don't intend to repeat it here and now. The LFB was also aware of the following international cladding fires: the Lacrosse Docklands in Melbourne, as well as the Address and the Torch, both of which were in Dubai. These fires are also referred to in greater detail in our written submissions, and we don't intend to repeat it here. We now come to the extent of training to operational staff on the risks associated with cladding systems. And despite the LFB's knowledge of the previously stated fires, we submit that there was only very limited training delivered to operational crews on the hazards of cladding systems and combustible sandwich panels, particularly in high-rise residential buildings. It was established in phase 1 of this inquiry that the following senior firefighters present on the night of the fire did not receive training on how to fight cladding fires: Watch Manager Dowden, Watch Manager Brian O'Keefe, Crew Managers Charles Batterby, David Davies, Charles Secret, and Jamal Stern. And the following is a list of training materials that has been disclosed in the inquiry which were available to operational crews before the night of the fire. And this, of course, excludes Lackland House case study. An article in the LFB publication Operational News entitled, quote, Insulating Sandwich Panels, end quote, did refer to insulating sandwich panels, but not in relation to high-rise buildings. The article stated, and I quote, the incident commander must react very quickly and be responsible to new information and evidence of changing conditions, but did not provide any further guidance. A firefighter training program entitled OP002 Building Construction was disclosed to the inquiry by third-party training provider Babcock. It was part of the Core Skills Firefighter Development Program in November 2014. The program had a single page entitled Sandwich Panels Used in Construction, but it did not relate to use in high-rise residential buildings, nor the specific hazards associated with compartmented high-rise buildings. It stated, and I quote, they are often used in conjunction with lightweight steel to provide exterior walls and roofing for large retail outlets and warehouses. It listed some hazards to firefighters, including rapid fire spread, toxic smoke, and the possibility that, quote, sandwich panels involved in fire may fail suddenly. A firefighting training program entitled OP23, Firefighting in Buildings 1, was also part of the Core Skills Development course in February 2015. Under the heading Construction, it stated, quote, age, materials used, and system of buildings will greatly affect fire development and influence the firefighting tactics used. OP001 Building Construction deals with this subject in more detail. We note, however, that OP001 Building Construction did not refer to cladding materials or sandwich panels. An overview of a back-to-basics firefighter tactical decision exercise produced by the LFB in 2016 includes a scenario for a high-rise training exercise. This involved, quote, intense fire conditions in the flat of origin with vertical smoke and fire spread up exterior cladding or fascia in a residential high-rise building. The inquiry legal team has already noted that the scenario did not look for firefighters to identify the cladding as a means of fire spread, nor did it address the risk associated specifically with cladding or combustible materials. At paragraph 38 of his second witness statement, LFB's current Assistant Director of Training, Peter Groves, referred to training document TCAP 0212 entitled Highly Insulated Building. This was intended to raise training which would address hazards associated with combustible insulation rather than sandwich panels and cladding. This was raised in October 2015 and related to computer-based packages linked to the LFB publication, Operational News Issue 30. We refer to training document TCAP 0212 in greater detail in our written submissions, and again, we don't intend to repeat that detail here. What we do note here is that TCAP 0212 requested training that ensured that firefighters should, and I quote, be aware of the implications on their firefighting tactics of the increasing use of highly insulated sealed compartments, fire development in these compartments, and the hazards associated with modern methods of construction. Under the section entitled, quote, what do you want to achieve, end quote, the TCAP training document stated that the computer-based training package intended to reference, quote, technologies that are used to make this happen, Celtex and Kingspan, etc. It noted that, quote, this technology is highly interdependent. If one aspect fails, it can undermine the entire designed solution. And it recommended that the training should address, quote, what a perfect response should look like, consideration of compartment failure, and effects crews can anticipate under compartment fire conditions. In his second witness statement to the inquiry, Mr. Groves of the LFB stated that the computer-based training which arose from this training document was withdrawn due to IT issues. And it was intended that it would be relaunched in Operational News Issue 40, which was to be issued after the Grenfell Tower fire. Mr. Groves does not mention why the training was not relaunched until after the fire. In her witness statement, the inquirer, Ms. Cara Kelly of training provider Babcock, said that Babcock did not receive a new TCAP request from the LFB in relation to the same. This is important because it was the only TCAP training document exhibited which addressed the specific hazards of combustible installation in such level of detail, and it was not relaunched until after Grenfell. On the 19th of August 2016, the LFB attended an external cladding fire in a 20-storey residential block in Shepherd's Bush. Approximately 50 occupants were evacuated. On the 30th of August 2016, the cladding panels from the Shepherd's Court fire were tested by testing company Bureau Veritas, with staff from the LFB's Fire Engineering Department. The consequent report produced by Bureau Veritas indicated the panels were, quote, likely to have assisted the fire in spreading up the outside of the building. In April 2017, some months later, LFB's Senior Communications Officer Martin Simpson emailed the Brigades' current Head of Fire Safety, Assistant Commissioner Daniel Daly, as well as the Head of Regulatory Enforcement Andy Jack and Assistant Commissioner Andy Hearn, about an article from Inside Housing, the publication. This article addressed the role of external cladding in the Shepherd's Court fire. Mr. Simpson's email highlighted a quote in the article from a chartered surveyor and fire safety expert, which stated, quote, this kind of spread can be catastrophic, particularly where flames can get through windows and if a stay-put policy is in place for residents. The LFB produced a PowerPoint presentation setting out information about the Shepherd's Court fire and the conclusions of the Bureau Veritas cladding panel testing. According to the witness statement of LFB fire engineer Mr. David Green, who produced the presentation, it was given to LFB fire engineering liaison officers and senior fire safety officers in October 2016. The LFB did not disseminate the presentation to operational crews. In her oral evidence of the inquiry, former LFB Commissioner Ms. Cotton was not familiar with the presentation and could not explain why the circulation of the presentation was only restricted to a limited group of LFB fire engineers. In addition, in his witness statement of the inquiry, Assistant Commissioner Daly stated that in his view, the incident has similarities with the Lackell House fire, and as such, quote, it did not appear to be a new hazard, as an awareness of external fire spread is referenced in LFB high-rise firefighting policy. He stated that the effectiveness of firefighting actions in arresting the fire spread of the building led him to believe that, quote, there was no need for additional messages to operational crews. In his statement to the Metropolitan Police, Assistant Commissioner Daly explained that he raised the Shepherd's Court fire as an issue internally for inclusion in the LFB's publication, what I've already referred to, operational news. He said that he was fairly certain that the issue did not feature in operational news until after Grenfell. He explained, quote, in fairness, I imagine there is always a long queue of material waiting to be featured. You can't send out and document every bit of learning required, as people can only absorb so much in a period of time. He noted that there was, in his words, quote, something, end quote, in operational news in August 2018 about high-rise firefighting which addressed the withdrawal of stay put in favour of evacuation. The LFB were aware of cladding fires that resulted in the evacuation of residents, often from buildings with a stay put policy in place. In particular, the fires at Madingley, Dorrington Point and Shepherd's Court. Evidence has also been disclosed in the inquiry of other high-rise fires the London Fire Brigade attended, which resulted in evacuation. And in our written submissions, we refer to the following fires: the Adair Tower fire, a fire at Grenfell Tower in 2010, and a fire at Tydesley Tower. Again, we don't intend to repeat the submissions here today. In addition to those fires, Policy Note number 633, the LFB's internal policy on high-rise firefighting at the time of the Grenfell Tower stated this: it may be necessary to undertake a partial or full evacuation in a residential building where a stay put policy is in place. But despite this statement in the LFB's high-rise policy and their knowledge of the high-rise fires where evacuation took place, either as a result of a cladding fire or otherwise, at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, the LFB had, quote, not provide personnel with explicit guidance as to when and how it should be withdrawn. This is according to the witness statement of the current LFB Commissioner, Mr. Andrew Rowe, who was an Assistant Commissioner, as we know, in January 2016, and was in that role on the night of the fire. Commissioner Rowe was the 4th Incident Commander on the night of the fire from 2:44 a.m. to 12:35 p.m. And he disapplied the stay put strategy at 2:47 a.m. In his first statement to the inquiry, he stated, quote, LFB openly recognised that there are no clear parameters in its policies or training for when and how stay put strategy should be disapplied and what alternatives should be put in place. According to the Phase 1 report, LFB Incident Commander Watch Manager Dowden did not evacuate Grenfell Tower by 1:50 a.m. at the latest. He should have realised, did not evacuate Grenfell Tower and, quote, by 1:50 a.m. at the latest, he should have realised that the fire had begun to enter the interior of the building and that compartmentation, which underpins the stay put advice, had been breached. The report stated that Watch Manager Dowden should have spoken to the LFB's control room and, quote, should have decided to evacuate the building. In his oral evidence inquiry, Watch Manager Dowden stated that he could not recall receiving training on when a partial or full evacuation may be necessary. He stated that he had no input from any individual on understanding when it may be necessary to have a full evacuation, and he only referred to internal high-rise policy. He also said that he could not recall training on this and only had experience of theory-based scenarios for training on evacuation from high floors. Firefighter Michael Pohl, the firefighter whom our client Mr. Paulus Tekle, who's here today, wished to call as a Module 5 witness, commented in his statement to the Metropolitan Police that he had not received any training about what to do if a building compartment fails. This is despite receiving high-rise training and training on compartment firefighting. So you'll recall that at 2 a.m. on the night of the fire, Mr. Tekle asked for himself and his family to, quote, be helped out of the flat, but was told by a firefighter that, quote, we, that is Mr. Tekle and his family, were safe in the flat and that we should just cover the front door with a blanket. In his witness statement to the inquiry, Mr. Tekle stated, if we had been given proper instructions by the firefighter, we would have attempted to leave at that time. Mr. Tekle, in fact, left his flat on the 18th floor at around 2:56 a.m., nearly an hour later. Mr. Tekle has asked us to remind you, sir, and the panel members, that tragically his 5-year-old son, Isaac Paulus, did not make it out of the tower. Mr. Tekle firmly believes that had the firefighters carried out their duties correctly, his son would still be alive today. The evacuation of residents, evacuation strategies, and the stay put policy are referenced in the LFB's high-rise training, but they focus on the idea of evacuation rather than practical guidance of when and how to undertake an evacuation of residents following the withdrawal of stay put advice from a high-rise building, in particular where there is no pre-existing evacuation plan. The training disclosed also referred to the stay put policy, but did not refer to the possibility of changing advice to evacuation, or the possibility of emergency evacuation or mass rescue of occupants. A 2010 Babcock PowerPoint firefighting training presentation on high-rise incidents referred to self-evacuation. It stated, quote, firefighters entering a building may find themselves travelling against the flow of people evacuating from the building. The presentation also referred to residential buildings, but noted that, quote, in residential buildings, occupants should only evacuate if the fire or smoke is in their property. Firefighting operations can be hampered by the number and type of people being evacuated. A 2011 LFB training PowerPoint presentation entitled High-Rise Buildings and Dealing with High-Rise Fires stated in its slides that, quote, in residential buildings, occupants should normally only evacuate if the fire is in the flat or maisonette, and if the fire is located in another part of the building, occupants should normally be advised to stay in their home unless they are being affected by heat or smoke. A July 2016 Babcock high-rise procedure course called OP007, which was part of the core skills firefighter development training, referred to fire spread from one compartment to another and the possibility of external fire spread. The PowerPoint slides also referred to evacuation, but in relation to commercial high-rise buildings rather than residential, and in relation to pre-planned evacuation procedure. In his expert report to the inquiry, firefighting expert Mr. Steve Girk stated, quote, I've seen some training documents that mention the possibility of changing stay-put advice and or evacuating residents, but this is not addressed in any detail, and nothing that I have seen would indicate that the training provided actually address when and how this should happen. One example of this is the Blackwall Tower exercise and the Holcroft House Command Decision exercise that is exhibited to the statement of Cara Kelly is similar in this respect. In addition to this, in Mr. Groves' statement to the Metropolitan Police, he commented that there was, quote, there was no standalone training on mass evacuation, but that was the intention going forward, that a standalone package will be created and is, quote, a direct result of the Grenfell Tower fire. We have not had sight of any policies as to how the LFB executed or assisted evacuations in premises with a get-out and stay-put policy. We've also seen very few references in their disclosure to evacuating anyone other than fire service personnel. For example, a July 2011 Babcock training presentation that was disclosed to the inquiry concerning firefighter emergency evacuation and tactical withdrawal focused on firefighter evacuations. In his expert report, Mr. McGurk stated, quote, "The overall impression is that LFB's incident command training did not prepare personnel for the possibility of needing to evacuate a high-rise building with no pre-existing evacuation plan, specifically when this decision should be taken and how an evacuation should be carried out." In his report, Mr. McGurk agreed with your findings, Chair, that the capacity of the stairs was sufficient for mass evacuation and remained substantially free of smoke until 1:50 a.m. He also agreed with your finding, Chair, in relation to the need to attempt mass evacuation. In addition, in her statement to the Metropolitan Police, firefighter Jasmine Bates criticised the strategy for emergency search and rescue and evacuation on the night of the fire. She stated firefighters were being told to go to individual flats when there were actually people in every flat, and maybe we should have been checking and clearing floor by floor. So it's already been mentioned by Mr. Friedman, Queen's Counsel, about the Kent Fire and Rescue Service firefighting policy, the alternative. The LFB was aware of an alternative firefighting strategy for high-rise residential buildings. It was developed by Dr. Paul Grimwood of Kent Fire and Rescue Service. It developed a strategy known as RICE, Rescue Intervention Containment Evacuation. It was bespoke to high-rise buildings, developed by Dr. Grimwood in 2008 and focused on the philosophy of, quote, protect the escape route at all times and stairwell protection. The strategy also addressed the reversal of stay-put advice. And according to Mr. McGurk's report, the following 4 triggers are used by Kent Fire and Rescue to assist an incident commander to reverse stay-put: fire development, smoke travel, self-evacuation, and a compromised escape route. And we have considered Dr. Grimwood's work on stairwell protection in RICE in further detail in our written submissions, but we don't intend to repeat it here. Dr. Grimwood stated that he was invited as part of a small team of representatives from the Chief Fire Officers Association South East Regional High-Rise Task Group to meet with Deputy Assistant Commissioner Peter Cowell of the LFB. The discussion during the meeting centred on the South East region's approach to developing procedures to mitigate smoke entering stairwells and the use of RICE. In his report, Mr. McGurk assessed Kent's Standard Operating Procedure, SOP, and accepted that RICE, quote, would have potentially made a difference at Grenfell, even taking into account the practical difficulties outlined in the Phase 1 report, and would have been preferable to the approach followed by LFB on the night of the fire. He explained that the 4 triggers to reverse stay put were all present at Grenfell at an early stage, and, quote, would have given the signal that evacuation needed to be considered. If the LFB had trained its firefighters in the use of Kent's SOP, quote, he says, it is certainly possible, even likely, that more lives could have been saved. However, note of caution, Mr. McGurk emphasised the need not to jump to the conclusion that using Kent's SOP would have prevented fatalities. Module 5 of this inquiry will address the adequacy of what's known as the LFB's training on Section 7.2D visits. In brief, Section 7.2D of the Fire and Rescue Services Act 2004 placed a responsibility on the Fire and Rescue Authority to make arrangements for obtaining information needed for the purpose of extinguishing fires and protecting life. The information collected by the LFB during the Section 7.2D of familiarising visits is recorded on the Operational Response Database, ORD. In our submissions, we say that the London Fire Brigade did not adequately train its operational crews to be aware of the risk of cladding systems and combustible sandwich panels when conducting these familiarisation visits. This is despite its considerable knowledge of cladding fires and the guidance set out in LFB internal policies. For example, policy note number 800 and policy note number 63 at Appendix 1. I'm not going to take you through those today. In his expert report, Mr. McGurk argues that the London Fire Brigade policies adequately met the requirements of Section 7.2d in reference to those policy documents. However, Policy Note 63 did not refer to cladding explicitly, but it did include, quote, the likelihood and impact of any fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues, and, quote, any building design features which may promote rapid or abnormal fire spread, such as sandwood panels or voids. However, Mr. McGurk concludes that the London Fire Brigade had a superficial approach to management systems to ensure these policy notes were complied with on the ground, and failed to train and educate operational staff to understand the requirements of Section 7.2d. In his Phase 2 expert report inquiry, Professor Jose Torrero states this: in regard to Grenfell Tower, the LFB failed to obtain the necessary information through inspections to enable it to conduct an adequate risk assessment. An adequate risk assessment would have identified the potential for June 14, 2017 scenario, and would have determined two possible paths of action, of rectification or a change in response tactics. It was also established in Phase 1 of this inquiry that Watch Manager Dowden and the North Kensington crew, who were responsible for the visit to Grenfell Tower, did not discover that combustible materials were used on Grenfell Tower. This, we say, should have been obtained from Kensington Chelsea TMO. They are also not trained on how materials used in exterior facades might behave in a fire, and therefore could not have been expected to assess risks created by the cladding system. In terms of the training material on Section 7.2d visits, which has been disclosed in the inquiry, the LFB publication Operational News Issue 24 indicated that a training package was available to London Fire Brigade operational crews. Neither the article itself nor the associated PowerPoint presentation referred to the consideration of building design features or the relevant hazards. In December, we now address the quality and advocacy of Section 7.2d operational response database entries. In general, concerns regarding the quality of Section 7.2d visits and adequate guidance to crews were known to the London Fire Brigade, particularly following the Lakenhall House inquest in 2013. In December 2013, Borough Commander John Elwell was tasked with discharging Action 18B of the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations, namely to create an inspection regime targeted at high-priority buildings. Borough Commander John Elwell sent both Assistant Commissioner David Brown and Deputy Assistant Commander Tom George his briefing paper, which was entitled Action 18B, LFB Consolidated Action Plan, on the 13th of December 2013. The briefing paper noted, quote, a number of substandard examples were found this could indicate a poor understanding of the rationale and lack of competency, and recommended, quote, further training is provided to all personnel with a role in the ORD process. Despite this, the LFB's preliminary report of the head of the Grenfell Tower review team produced in 2019 following the Grenfell Tower said this: operational risk information provides no practical guidance on undertaking 7.2d visits and focused on the process for identifying premises which may become subject to such visits. It's also stated, quote, it's been observed that the information provided in the Brigades policies and associated training packages in relation to undertaking 7.2d visits is not completely aligned with policy referred to in Operational News 24. So, panel, we deal with the issue of communications. The LFB, we say, were aware of problems surrounding communication equipment and its use in high-rise concrete buildings. And this has been addressed in detail in Professor Chris Johnson's report to the inquiry. He concluded that failures in communication on 95, whilst caused by various factors, caused a risk to life to both firefighters and residents of Grenfell Tower, and reduced situational awareness of firefighters on the night of the fire. He provided the example of the loss of life on floor 14 when firefighters were unable to request additional support to assist in the rescue of residents found there. We've considered in some detail the issue of communication in our written submissions, and we summarise those in this way. Firstly, the age and adequacy of the LFB's communications equipment and their failure to update its equipment. We note that in her statement to the Met Police, firefighter Jasmine Bates stated, quote, I feel that better communication would have helped. The actual equipment was poor, and I was aware that equipment literally fell apart. Secondly, the LFB's awareness of communication problems in high-rise buildings, particularly following the Lakenhall House fire, and their failure to provide policies or training on recovery from widespread communications failures. Thirdly, we note the LFB's consideration of methods of mitigating communication problem in high-rise buildings. And finally, we raise the issue of testing for communication black spots during familiarisation visits. And we know that Professor Johnson stated that communications tests carried out for Grenfell Tower fire did not test for potential communication problems sufficient. He recommended the LFB adopt, quote, validated test procedures to assess radio coverage in high-rise buildings. So that brings us to what conclusions we might draw from all of this. And it seems to our clients that if the evidence that we have seen and that our clients have considered that's been adduced thus far in this module and what comes before you in the next few days, if it reflects the material disclosed and referred to previously, the tragedy of the Grenfell fire should not and cannot be considered in the context of hindsight, as Mr. Thomas Queen's counsel so eloquently put it. It is not a situation in which it can be said that, quote, had we known then what we know now, lives could have been saved. The simple fact is that the LFB did know. They knew. And lives could have been and should have been saved for a number of reasons. Firstly, senior staff at the LFB had considerable knowledge of national and international exterior cladding fires, and yet they failed to disseminate this information to its firefighters, those on the ground. With this knowledge, the LFB should have trained firefighters about the dangers of external cladding and armed them with techniques to fight such fires. Had the crews and the incident commanders on the night of the fire been trained to fight external cladding fires, they would have been better prepared. And so, lives could have been saved. Secondly, senior staff at the LFB were aware of the hazards of flammable cladding. Despite this knowledge, they did not provide sufficient training to firefighters conducting pre-site familiarisation visits to recognise the risks of the use of cladding in high-rise buildings. Had the crews who inspected Grenfell Tower received this training, they could have discovered that dangerous cladding was used during its refurbishment. As Professor Terrera stated, had the London Fire Brigade obtained this information, firefighting tactics in relation to Grenfell Tower could have been rectified in the light of this information. So, lives could have been saved. Thirdly, in relation to pre-site familiarisation visits, the LFB were aware that information available to firefighters during incidents was often incomplete due to the lack of information collected by firefighters during pre-site visits. Despite knowledge of these concerns, the LFB only provided minimal training and practical guidance to the firefighters who carried out those visits. Had the firefighters who conducted the pre-site visit at Grenfell Tower received adequate training and guidance, they would not have omitted vital information from their entries. In turn, this would have aided firefighters on the night of the fire in their efforts to save the residents of Grenfell Tower. Sir, lives could have been saved. Fourthly, the LFB had knowledge of previous high-rise fires, which resulted in the evacuation of residents despite having a stay-put policy in place. The LFB's own high-rise policy contemplated that stay-put advice may be abandoned in favour of evacuation. Despite this, the LFB failed to provide firefighting crews with guidance as to when and how this should be carried out. Had the LFB provided this training to its firefighters and incident commanders, then Incident Command would have known to abandon stay-put advice in favour of evacuation far earlier on the night of the fire. This, in turn, would have prevented further fatalities on the night of the fire. Sir, I repeat, lives could have been saved. Fifth, senior staff at the LFB were aware of alternative high-rise firefighting strategies, which would have aided incident commanders and their crews to recognise when stay-put advice should be abandoned and how to carry out an evacuation. As inquiry expert Mr. McGurk stated in his conclusion, had the LFB trained firefighters to use these strategies, more lives could have been saved. Sixth, as inquiry expert Professor Johnson noted, communication problems on the night of the fire cause a significant risk to lives of the residents of Grenfell Tower. The inquiry might consider that the communication problems experienced by firefighters on the night of the fire may have been exacerbated by the LFB's neglect to update its equipment and its failure to train its operational staff in how to mitigate communication black spots and failures. So, panel members, we invite you to explore this and the methods by which the LFB could have mitigated communication failures and whether, as a result, any lives could have been saved. So we end finally on the issue of training on diversity. And we note, amongst the many thousands of documents that have been disclosed to us, there is only one mention of training on diversity in all the disclosure that we've had. As a result, we wrote the inquiry on the 10th of June this year, and we said this: we found only one reference to any form of equality and diversity training in the material disclosed. This is at paragraph 5 of Ms. Rita Dexter's witness statement, which states that she managed and led the equalities team. And we asked, sir, a number of questions, ending in this way. We said this, quote, "In short, we are trying to ascertain whether there was, at any point leading up to the fire at Grenfell, any form of equality and diversity training given to the LFB or any such policies in existence." And the inquiry responded, and I quote, "The inquiry has not specifically sought disclosure from the LFB on its equality and diversity training and policies, as such matters fall outside the inquiry's terms of reference. To the extent that you consider such matters to impact the issues set out in the inquiry's terms of reference and list of issues, we would invite you to include this in your proposed questions for witnesses and in any representations you may wish to make to the inquiry in the course of Module 5 and or 6. And sir, we must say that our clients were incredibly disappointed, to say the least, with this response. You'll be aware that on behalf of our cohort of clients, we have at the outset, and I remember the first opening submissions that I made at Holborn Bars, we have consistently been submitting that the inquiry needs to consider the issue of the makeup of the residents of the tower and how they were treated before, during, and after the fire. You don't need reminding, so what we said in our opening statement in relation to phase 2, we said this, whilst we've identified at least 15 key missed opportunities on the part of those involved in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, we note there's actually been a missed opportunity for this inquiry, and that is to recognise the issues of race and social class, which we on behalf of our clients argue should be an integral part of this inquiry. So we yet again urge the inquiry to examine whether the treatment of those who occupy the tower was any different because of their background. This is especially so when the head of the LFB itself, Mr. Andy Rowe, has gone on record in the Guardian newspaper of the 19th of March 2021 to state this, quote, "A culture of casual racism and misogyny remains so prevalent within pockets of the organisation that he feared his mixed heritage daughter might not be treated with dignity and respect at some fire stations." The article went on to state, quote, "Andy Rowe paid tribute to the kindness and bravery of his colleagues who risk their lives regularly and have reached in to rescue people regardless of background." But he added this, "In my experience, the same people might then come back to the fire station and express themselves casually in racist terms, in misogynist terms, use crude language around faith and sexuality. We are awash with really great people who are really kind and will be there for anyone at their point of crisis. But we still have elements of our culture that we need to transparently face up to and unpick." And we say this, members of the panel. We submit that any organisation in which there is clear evidence of racism and misogyny, as accepted by its chief officer, must at the very least consider whether it is capable of delivering an appropriate service to a population as diverse as that which exists in London, and whether it did so specifically to those that lived in Grenfell Tower. There is then an even greater necessity for this inquiry to examine this issue for itself, particularly when the proportion of black and minority ethnic firefighters in the London Fire Brigade stands at around 15%, while serving a city with a black and minority ethnic population of around 40%. The Guardian article referred to the LFB's own data, which shows that employees from African, Caribbean, and Asian backgrounds, all with English as a second language, were less likely to be promoted, more likely to be subject to formal and informal discipline, and more likely to be made to retake training modules. To assert that the LFB's equality and diversity training and policies fall outside the inquiry's terms of reference, sir, in the light of Mr. Rowe's admission at the LFB's own data, is in our client's opinion, and we don't say this lightly, a dereliction of the inquiry's duties and obligations, which serves only to cause our clients greater injustice. On their behalf, on Mr. Tekle's behalf, we ask that this be immediately rectified. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Well, the next statement is due to be made on behalf of the Mayor of London by Ms. Studd, Queen's Counsel, but she is not going to appear in person. She's going to make that statement remotely at 2 o'clock. So I think at that point we must rise for the moment and we will resume with Ms. Studd's statement at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.